I signed the marriage contract with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking and a man who didn't need to threaten me to make me obey. The pen felt heavier than it should have, like it carried the weight of everything I was about to lose, and maybe everything I didn't understand yet. And when I looked up from the paper, the room felt too quiet, too still, like even the air knew this wasn't just another agreement. This was a transaction with consequences I couldn't measure in dollars or days or anything that made sense to a normal life. Because nothing about Alexander Vance was normal, not the way he stood across from me in that perfectly tailored black suit, not the way people avoided meeting his eyes, and definitely not the way my father couldn't stop trembling beside me like a man who had already accepted defeat long before tonight ever came. And I remember thinking, this isn't happening. This can't be happening. Because just 24 hours ago, my biggest problem was figuring out how to stretch my paycheck far enough to cover rent and groceries. And now I was sitting in a room that smelled faintly of expensive leather and something colder, something controlled, staring at a contract that didn't feel like a choice at all. And the worst part was that nobody had raised their voice. Nobody had made a scene. There were no dramatic threats or chaos, just quiet certainty. Just the kind of power that didn't need to prove itself because it already owned the outcome. And when Alexander finally spoke, his voice was low, calm, measured in a way that made my chest tighten. He didn't look at my father. When he said it, he looked at me, like I was the only variable that mattered, like the rest of the room had already been decided. You understand the terms, he said. And I wanted to say no. I wanted to argue, to demand explanations, to ask how a person could be written into a contract like a piece of property. But the words wouldn't come out the way I imagined them. They came out smaller, weaker, like they belonged to someone who was already losing. This isn't real, I whispered, even though the paper in front of me said otherwise, even though the ring sitting beside it caught the light in a way that made everything feel final. And for a moment, just a moment, something shifted in his expression, not softness, not kindness, but something almost human, like he heard the fear I couldn't hide, like he recognized it. And then it was gone, replaced by that same controlled distance, that same unreadable calm. It's real enough, he replied, and I realized then that this wasn't about convincing me. It was about whether I would resist or comply, and somehow that made it worse, because resisting felt pointless in a room where every exit had already been closed before I even knew I was trapped. And I glanced at my father, hoping for something, anything, a sign that this could still be stopped. But he couldn't even meet my eyes, and that silence said more than any words ever could. It said this was happening, with or without my consent, and suddenly the pen in my hand didn't feel like a choice. It felt like the last thing I had control over, the only moment where I could decide how I entered a life I never asked for. And my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears as I lowered the pen to the paper, hesitated for just a second, and then signed my name, Emily Carter, in ink that looked too permanent, too final. And when I finished, when I set the pen down and looked up again, Alexander Vance didn't smile, didn't celebrate, didn't react at all. He just picked up the contract, glanced at it once, and said quietly, almost like it was an afterthought, "Good." And I didn't understand why that single word felt more terrifying than anything else he could have said, because it sounded like something had just been set in motion, something I couldn't stop anymore, something that had nothing to do with love or choice or anything I had ever believed marriage was supposed to be. And as he slid the ring across the table toward me, I realized I hadn't just agreed to marry a man I didn't know. I had stepped into a world where rules were different, where power looked like silence, and where the most dangerous thing about Alexander Vance wasn't what he might do, but what he chose not to do. The ring was colder than I expected. Heavier too, like it carried a meaning that had nothing to do with tradition and everything to do with ownership. And I stared at it resting in my palm for a second too long before realizing everyone in the room was watching me, waiting for something, a reaction, a refusal, a breakdown. I did not know which one they expected, but Alexander did not move, did not rush me. He simply stood there with that same unreadable expression, as if time worked differently for him, as if he could wait forever. Because in his world, outcomes did not change, only the path you took to accept them did. And I hated that thought, hated the way it made me feel small, predictable, like my fear was just another step in a process he had already calculated. So I did the only thing that felt like it still belonged to me. I slipped the ring onto my finger myself, slowly, deliberately, meeting his gaze as I did it. And something flickered in his eyes again, brief and gone before I could name it. Approval, maybe. Or recognition, not of submission, but of something else, something closer to defiance. And that unsettled me more than anything else that had happened tonight, because it meant he noticed. It meant he was paying attention to things I did not even understand about myself yet. Good, he said again, quieter this time. And then he turned away like the moment was already over for him. Like the most life-altering decision I had ever made was just another item checked off a list. And that was when the door opened and everything moved at once. Men in dark suits stepping forward. The room shifting from stillness to motion with a kind of silent coordination that felt practiced, inevitable. And before I could process it fully, one of them was already at my side, not touching me, just close enough to guide, to suggest direction without forcing it, which somehow made it harder to resist, because it felt like I was choosing to walk instead of being dragged, and I hated that too, hated how easily. This world blurred the line between choice and control, and as I stepped out into the hallway, I realized I had not said goodbye, not to my father, not to the life I had known, and when I glanced back, he was still sitting there, head in his hands, smaller than I had ever seen him, and for a second, I wanted to run back, to undo everything, to demand that someone explain how this was allowed, but the door closed before I could take a single step, sealing that version of my life behind it with a quiet finality that echoed louder than any slammed door ever could. And the next thing I knew, I was outside. The night air hitting my skin like a shock, cool and sharp, grounding in a way nothing else had been. A black car waiting at the curb like it had been there all along. Like it had been waiting for me specifically, and Alexander was already there, already seated inside, as if he had skipped the entire transition between contract and departure, as if distance and time did not apply to him the way they did to everyone else. And for a moment I hesitated, standing under the streetlight with my hand still wrapped around the car door handle, the city stretching out around me in familiar shapes that suddenly felt foreign, unreachable, like I was already leaving even before the car started moving. Emily. His voice came from inside the car, calm, not impatient, just certain, and I realized he had never raised his voice once. Not in that room. Not now. And somehow that made it impossible to ignore him, because there was no emotion to push against, no anger to resist, just expectation. And expectation was harder to fight than force. So I got in, the door closing softly behind me, sealing me into a space that felt too controlled, too quiet. And as the car pulled away from the curb, I watched the street I had walked 1,000 times disappear behind us, each passing second putting distance between me and everything I had ever known. And I kept waiting for him to say something, to explain, to justify, to give me a reason that made this feel less like a transaction and more like something human. But he did not. He just sat there beside me, composed, distant, like a man who had already considered every question I might ask and decided none of them required answers. And finally, when the silence stretched too far, when the weight of it pressed down on my chest until I could not ignore it anymore, I turned to him and said the only thing that mattered, the only thing I needed to understand before anything else. Why me? And for the first time since this started, he did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting from the window to me, steady, assessing, like he was deciding how much truth I could handle. And when he finally spoke, his voice was softer, quieter than before, but no less controlled. Because, he said, pausing just long enough to make the word feel deliberate, you were the only one who did not look away. His answer should not have made sense, but it did. And that was the problem, because I remembered the moment he was talking about, the way I had looked at him in that room before everything changed, not with fear, not right away, but with something else, something honest. And I hated that he had seen it, hated that out of everything I had tried to hide, that was the one thing he chose. That is not a reason, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. And he did not argue, did not try to convince me otherwise. He just held my gaze for a second longer before turning back to the window, like the conversation was already finished for him, like explanations were optional in his world, and silence filled the space again, heavier this time, because now it carried meaning. Now it felt like there were things he was not saying, things he was choosing to keep to himself. And I realized then that whatever I thought I understood about this situation, it was only the surface, only the part he allowed me to see. And that thought settled into my chest with a quiet unease that did not go away even as the city lights blurred past outside, each block taking me farther from the version of my life that had made sense, and closer to something I could not define yet, something controlled, structured, deliberate, just like him. And when the car finally slowed, turning through a set of gates that opened before we even stopped, I felt it. That shift again, like crossing an invisible line between two different worlds, one where things happened by chance, and one where everything was decided long before you arrived, and the house, if it could even be called that, came into view slowly, rising out of the darkness with clean lines and glass and stone that reflected the soft glow of carefully placed lights, not loud, not extravagant in the way I expected, but precise, controlled, like every detail had been chosen for a reason. And as the car came to a stop, I hesitated again, my hand resting on the door handle, not because I thought I could leave, but because stepping out meant accepting that this was real, that this place, this life, was mine now in a way I had never chosen. And before I could decide what that meant, his voice came again, closer this time, because he had already moved, already stepped out and come around to my side without me noticing. "You can stay in the guest wing," he said, like he was discussing something ordinary, like we were not standing at the edge of a life neither of us had explained. And I looked up at him, searching for something, anything that made this make sense. "Guest wing," I repeated, because the words felt strange in my mouth, like they belonged to someone else. And he nodded once, calm, certain. "You will have privacy," he added, and there was something in the way he said it, something deliberate, like he was offering it, not just stating it. And that made me pause, because nothing about this situation felt like it came with options, nothing except this one thing he kept emphasizing without fully explaining: space, distance, control, not over me, but over himself. And I stepped out of the car slowly, the cool night air brushing against my skin as I looked at the house again. Really looked this time, noticing the quiet, the absence of noise, the way everything felt contained, protected, like nothing happened here without his permission. And for the first time since this started, I wondered if that control extended beyond the world outside, if it reached into the space between us two. And as we walked inside, the doors closing softly behind us, sealing out the rest of the world, I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else he had said so far. He had taken everything from me without asking, except one thing, and I did not understand why that was the thing he chose to leave untouched. And as if he could hear that question forming in my mind, he stopped halfway down the hall, turning just enough to look at me, his expression unreadable, his voice quiet but clear. "There is one rule," he said, and the way the words settled in the air made my breath catch before I even knew why. "I will never touch you," he continued, each word measured, deliberate, like he needed me to understand exactly what he meant, "unless you ask me to." For a second, I thought I had misheard him, like my mind was trying to protect me by twisting his words into something safer, something that made sense. But the way he stood there, still, composed, watching me without any hint of hesitation, told me I had heard him exactly right. And that was what made it worse, because nothing about this situation suggested restraint. Nothing about a forced marriage to a man like Alexander Vance implied boundaries. And yet here he was, offering one, setting a line so clear it felt almost unreal. "That is your rule," I said slowly, testing the words, trying to understand where the trap was hidden, because there had to be one. There always was. And he nodded once, not defensive, not offended, just certain. "It is the only one that matters," he replied. And I let out a quiet breath I had not realized I was holding. Not relief, not exactly, but something close to it. Something fragile that I did not trust enough to accept yet, because rules could be broken, promises could be twisted, and men like him did not build their lives on limitations. They built them on control. And this felt like control too, just in a way I did not understand. "Why?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop it, because if there was one thing I needed to know, it was this: why would a man who could take anything he wanted choose not to? And for the first time, he did not answer immediately, his gaze shifting slightly, not away from me, but inward. Like the answer was not simple, like it came from somewhere deeper than the rest of this arrangement. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, still steady, still controlled, but carrying something else. Underneath, something I could not quite name. Because I can, he said, and I frowned. The response not what I expected. Not enough, not nearly enough. That is not an answer, I said, more firmly this time. And something almost like a shadow of a smile touched his expression, gone before it could fully form. It is the only one you are getting tonight, he replied. And then he stepped back, just a small movement, but enough to create space between us again, deliberate space, intentional. Distance, and I realized then that this was not just a rule for me. It was something he enforced on himself with the same precision he applied to everything else, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to reduce to manipulation, because it did not feel like a game. It felt like a boundary he had already decided he would not cross, regardless of what I did, and that thought lingered as he gestured down the hallway. Your room is at the end, he said, shifting the conversation as easily as he had started it. Like whatever had just passed between us did not need further explanation, and I hesitated for a second before moving, my footsteps quiet against the polished floor as I walked in the direction he indicated, hyper-aware of the distance between us, of the fact that he did not follow immediately, that he let me walk ahead, alone, unguarded in a way that felt almost disorienting after everything that had happened. And when I reached the room and pushed the door open, I stopped, not because it was extravagant, though it was, not because it was larger than my entire apartment, though it easily was, but because it did not feel like a place meant to contain someone. It felt like a place meant to be lived in, soft lighting, neutral colors, everything arranged with a kind of quiet intention that made it feel less like a display and more like a space someone had thought about, and I stepped inside slowly, turning in a small circle as I took it in, the reality of it settling around me piece by piece. And for the first time since I signed that contract, I did not feel like I was about to be cornered. I felt like I was being left alone, and that should have made me feel safer. But instead it left me with something else, something unfamiliar, uncertainty, because I did not know how to exist in a situation where the threat I expected never came, where the man who had taken everything from me chose restraint over force. And as I turned back toward the door, half expecting him to be standing there, watching, waiting, I found the hallway empty, silent, like he had already disappeared into another part of this house, into another part of his world that did not include me. And that was when it hit me. This rule, this distance, it did not make me free. It made me something else entirely, something I had not prepared for, something I did not understand yet. Because he had not taken my choice away completely, he had handed a piece of it back, and I did not know what to do with it. I did not sleep that night. Not really. Because every time I closed my eyes I expected something to change, for the quiet to break, for the reality of where I was to finally catch up with me in a way that made sense. But it never did. The silence held, steady and controlled, like the rest of this place. And sometime around 3 in the morning I gave up pretending, sitting up in the unfamiliar bed and staring out at the city lights in the distance, trying to anchor myself to something real, something I recognized. But even the skyline looked different from here. Smaller somehow, like I was seeing it from a height I had never reached before, and that thought stayed with me as the sky slowly shifted from black to gray, and then to the soft pale blue of early morning, marking the first day of a life I had never agreed to but was already living. And when I finally stood, moving through the room with quiet steps, everything felt too perfect, too untouched, like I was walking through a space that had been prepared in advance, waiting for someone to step into it and make it real, and I was not sure if that someone was supposed to be me, or if I was just filling a role that could have been anyone else. And that question lingered as I opened the door and stepped into the hallway, half expecting to find someone waiting, watching, but it was empty, just like the night before, calm and still in a way that felt intentional. And I followed the corridor slowly, guided more by instinct than direction, until I found myself in a larger space, a kitchen that looked like something out of a magazine. Clean lines, polished surfaces, everything in its place, and for a second I hesitated at the edge of it, unsure if I was allowed to be there, which was a strange thought considering I was technically supposed to live here now, but nothing about this felt like mine. Not yet, maybe not ever, and I moved anyway, drawn by the simple familiarity of routine, pouring a glass of water, the coolness grounding in a way the rest of this house was not, and I was just setting it down when I felt it. That shift in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the room had changed without making a sound, and I turned slowly. Already knowing what I would find before I saw him, Alexander stood in the doorway, exactly where I had not heard him approach, dressed the same as before, composed, controlled, like he had stepped out of the night and into the morning without ever losing that sense of stillness that seemed to follow him everywhere. And for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching between us, not uncomfortable exactly, but charged in a way I could not ignore. And I realized then that this was the first time we were alone without an audience, without a contract, without anything to distract from the reality of what we were now, and I did not know what that meant. Not yet. "You are awake early," he said finally, his voice as calm as ever, like he had expected to find me here, like nothing about this surprised him, and I let out a small breath, setting the glass down a little harder than I intended. I did not sleep, I admitted, because there was no point pretending otherwise. Not when everything about this situation made honesty feel easier than performance, and he nodded once, as if that confirmed something he already knew. "You will adjust," he said, not as reassurance, but as a fact, like everything else in his world, and something about that irritated me more than it should have, the certainty of it. The assumption that this was just a phase, something temporary before I settled into a life I had not chosen. "I am not staying," I said, the words coming out sharper than I expected, and for the first time, his gaze sharpened slightly, not anger, not even surprise, just attention, like I had finally said something worth noting, and he stepped into the room then, slow, deliberate, stopping a few feet away, far enough to keep that distance he had promised, and yet close enough that I could feel the weight of his presence. "You are," he replied simply, and I shook my head, frustration building in a way I could not hold back anymore. "You do not get to decide that," I said, even though part of me already knew he did, and his expression did not change, did not harden or soften. It remained exactly the same, controlled, unreadable, and that made it worse, because there was nothing to push against, nothing to argue with except the reality he represented. "I already have," he said, and the words settled between us with a finality that made my chest tighten, not because they were loud or forceful, but because they were quiet, certain, and completely unshakable. And for a moment I just stood there, staring at him, trying to find the crack in that certainty, the flaw in the logic, something I could use to push back. But all I found was the same thing I had seen from the beginning: control, not just over the situation, but over himself. And as much as I wanted to hate that, to reject it completely, a small part of me could not ignore the other side of it, the rule he had given me, the distance he maintained even now. And I realized then that this was not a prison in the way I expected. It was something more complicated, something harder to fight, because he was not taking everything. He was leaving just enough for me to question what this really was. And that uncertainty followed me long after he turned away and left the room, as quiet as he had entered, leaving me alone again with a life that no longer made sense and a man who did not need to force me to stay, because somehow, without realizing it, I already had. I tried to leave that afternoon, not dramatically, not with a plan that made sense, just a quiet decision that formed somewhere between frustration and the need to prove that I still could, because staying felt too much like accepting something I did not understand, and I could not accept something I did not choose. So I walked back to my room, pulled open the closet, and paused when I realized it was already filled, clothes in my size, shoes I had never seen, everything arranged with the same quiet precision as the rest of the house. And for a second I just stood there staring, the reality of it settling in deeper than before. This was not temporary. This was prepared, anticipated, decided long before I signed anything. And that thought should have stopped me, should have made me question whether leaving was even possible. But instead it pushed me forward, because if everything here was planned, then the only thing that was not was my choice to walk away, and I needed to know if that choice still existed. So I changed into something simple, something that felt like me: jeans, a light sweater, grounding myself in small familiar details before stepping back into the hallway, moving with more purpose this time, not wandering, not hesitating, just walking toward the front of the house, toward the doors I remembered from the night before, and each step felt louder than it should have, even though the house remained as silent as ever. No footsteps behind me, no voices calling me back, just the steady rhythm of my own breathing and the quiet certainty that I was doing something that mattered, even if I did not know how it would end. And when I finally reached the entrance, the door standing tall and still in front of me, I did not stop this time. I reached for the handle, turned it, and for a brief moment, it felt almost normal, like I was just stepping outside, like nothing about this was different from any other day. But then I opened the door and everything shifted, because the world outside was not empty. It was waiting, two men standing near the steps, not blocking the way, not moving toward me, just present, aware, and that was enough. That quiet awareness that made it clear they had seen me, that they knew exactly what I was doing without needing to say a word. And I stepped forward anyway, one step, then another, the cool air hitting my face as I moved past them, expecting something, a hand on my arm, a voice telling me to stop, but nothing came. They did not move, did not react, and for a second I thought maybe this was it. Maybe leaving was as simple as walking. Maybe the door had never been locked at all, and that thought carried me a few feet farther down the path. Before I heard it, my name, not loud, not urgent, just spoken with that same calm certainty that made it impossible to ignore. Emily. And I stopped before I could decide not to, my body reacting before my mind could catch up, and I turned slowly, already knowing what I would see. Alexander stood at the top of the steps, exactly where I had left him earlier, as if he had been there the entire time, watching, waiting, or maybe just knowing. And for a moment neither of us spoke. The distance between us filled with something heavier than silence, something that felt like a test I did not realize I was taking until now. I told you, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, holding on to the last thread of control I had left. I am not staying. And he nodded slightly, not dismissing it, not arguing, just acknowledging it in a way that made it feel smaller somehow, less like a challenge and more like an observation. And then he did something I did not expect. He stepped aside, just enough to clear the path behind him, not blocking me, not stopping me. And that simple movement changed everything, because suddenly the choice was real, not theoretical, not something I could argue about inside my head. It was right there in front of me, the open gate, the empty road beyond it. And I could leave. I could walk away from all of this, from him, from the contract, from the life that had been forced onto me. And for a second, I almost did. I turned back toward the road, took another step, felt the weight of it shift, like something was loosening its hold on me. And then I stopped, not because anyone told me to, not because anything physically held me back, but because of something else, something quieter, something I did not understand yet. And I turned again, looking back at him, really looking this time, at the way he stood there without moving closer, without reaching for me, without breaking the rule he had set even when it would have been easier to do so. And that was when it hit me. He was not stopping me. He was letting me decide. And somehow that made it harder to leave than anything else could have. Because if I walked away now, it would not be because I was forced to stay. It would be because I chose not to go. And that realization settled into my chest with a weight I was not prepared for. Because for the first time since this started, the decision was not his, it was mine. And I did not know what that said about me when my feet refused to move. The silence stretched longer than it should have, long enough for the air between us to feel heavy, like something was waiting to be decided. And I realized I was still standing there on the path, halfway between leaving and staying, caught in a moment that should have been simple, but was not. Because nothing about him was simple, and nothing about this choice felt clean anymore, and I hated that. Hated the way my feet stayed rooted to the ground, even though every logical part of me was telling me to keep walking, to take the exit he had just given me without question. But logic had nothing to do with it now, because logic did not explain why he had stepped aside instead of stopping me, why he had given me a way out when everything about him suggested he did not need to. And that question pulled me back, stronger than fear, stronger than anger, until I found myself turning fully to face him again. My voice quieter this time, not as sharp, but more certain in a different way. Why are you letting me go? I asked, because that was the part one could not understand, the part that did not fit into the version of him I had built in my head. And he did not answer right away, his gaze steady, watching me like he was measuring something I could not see. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm as ever, but there was something else underneath it, something that made the words land differently than before. "Because I told you the rule," he said, and I frowned slightly. The answer: not enough, not complete. "That rule does not mean I can just walk away," I said, gesturing toward the open gate, the empty road beyond it, the life that was still technically within reach if I chose it. And for a moment, something shifted in his expression. Again, not visible enough to define, but enough to make me feel like I had stepped closer to something real, something he did not show easily. "It means I will not make you stay," he replied, and the distinction hit harder than I expected, because he was right. He had never said I could not leave. He had only made it clear that he would not force me to remain, and somehow that difference changed everything, because it meant the weight of this decision was not his anymore. It was mine, entirely. Mine. And I did not know what to do with that. Did not know how to process a situation where the control I thought he had over me was suddenly replaced with something else, something that looked a lot like responsibility. And I looked away for a second, my gaze drifting back toward the road, the world outside that suddenly felt farther away than it had just moments ago. And I tried to imagine it, tried to picture myself walking away, going back to what I knew, to a life that made sense, to a version of myself that existed before this night. But the image did not hold. It slipped, incomplete, like something had already changed in a way I could not undo. And that realization unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant leaving would not erase what had happened. It would just leave questions behind, questions about him, about this place, about why a man who could control everything chose not to control the one thing that mattered most. And when I looked back at him again, he had not moved, not a single step closer, still respecting that invisible line he had drawn between us, still holding to the rule even now. And that was when I understood something I had been avoiding, something I had not wanted to admit. He was not testing me. He was showing me that his control was not about taking. It was about choosing when not to, and that kind of power was harder to walk away from than anything else, because it made me question everything I thought I knew about him, and about myself. And before I could stop myself, before I could overthink it or turn back toward the road again, I took a step in the opposite direction, toward him, slow, deliberate, closing a small part of the distance that had felt so absolute just seconds ago, and his gaze shifted slightly, following the movement, not surprised, not triumphant, just aware, and I stopped a few feet away, close enough to feel the weight of his presence again, but still within the boundary he had set. And for a moment neither of us spoke, because the choice had already been made, not in words, but in action. And I realized then that staying did not feel like losing anymore. It felt like stepping into something I did not understand yet, something complicated and uncertain and entirely different from what I had expected. And as that thought settled, quiet but undeniable, I met his eyes and said the only thing that felt honest in that moment. "I am not staying because you told me to." And his expression remained unchanged, but his voice, when he answered, carried a quiet certainty that matched the shift I felt inside myself. "I know," he said, and for the first time since this started, that answer did not feel like control. It felt like understanding. Something shifted after that moment, not in the world around me, not in the structure of the house or the quiet precision of everything Alexander controlled, but in the space between us, subtle and unspoken, like a line had been redrawn without either of us needing to acknowledge it out loud. And the walk back inside felt different, slower somehow, not because I hesitated, but because I was aware now in a way I had not been before, aware of the distance he kept, of the way he matched my pace, without ever closing the gap, like he was respecting something I had not even realized I was holding on to. And that awareness stayed with me long. After we stepped through the doors and the outside world disappeared behind us again, sealing us back into the controlled silence of his space. Except it did not feel like just his space anymore, not entirely. And that thought unsettled me enough that I did not speak at first, did not look at him as I moved further down the hallway, needing a moment to process the fact that I had chosen this, that I had turned away from the open road and walked back into something uncertain, something that still did not make sense, and yet felt impossible to leave behind. And I was halfway to the staircase when his voice stopped me again, not commanding, not demanding, just there, steady and calm as always. "You should eat," he said, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because after everything that had just happened, after the weight of that decision, I expected something more, something heavier. But instead he offered something ordinary, something almost normal, and I turned slightly, looking at him over my shoulder, searching his expression for any sign that this was anything other than what it seemed. But there was nothing there except that same composed stillness, that same quiet control, and for a moment I did not know how to respond, because normal felt unfamiliar here. It felt like something I could not trust yet, and I realized then that this might be the hardest part of all, not the contract, not the rule, not even the choice to stay, but the way he moved through all of it without forcing anything, without escalating it into something easier to define. And I exhaled slowly, turning fully to face him this time. "I am not hungry," I said, even though I was not entirely sure that was true. And he did not argue, did not insist. He simply nodded once, like my answer was enough, like he had no need to push further, and that should have ended the moment, should have allowed me to walk away without another thought. But it did not, because something about his restraint kept pulling my attention back, kept making me question the edges of what I thought I understood, and before I could stop myself, I spoke again, the question forming without permission. "Do you always do that?" I asked, and his gaze shifted slightly, focused now in a way that told me he was listening more carefully than before. "Do what?" he replied, and I hesitated for a second, trying to find the right words for something I was only just beginning to understand. "Give people a choice when you do not have to," I said finally, and the silence that followed was different this time, not empty, not neutral, but weighted with something deeper, something that made the air feel tighter, more focused. And he did not look away, did not dismiss the question or deflect it. He just stood there, considering it in a way that made it feel important, like it mattered more than anything else we had said so far. And when he answered, his voice was quieter than before, but more deliberate, each word placed carefully. "No," he said, and the honesty of it landed immediately, sharp and clear, because there was no attempt to soften it, no effort to make it sound better than it was, and that alone told me more than any explanation could have. "Then why me?" I asked again, softer this time, not challenging, not defensive, just trying to understand something that did not fit into anything I knew. And for a moment, just a moment, something changed in his expression, not enough to fully read, but enough to feel, like a crack in the surface of that control, like something real pressing against the boundaries he kept so carefully in place. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same quiet weight, that same controlled honesty. But this time, there was something else beneath it, something I had not heard before, something that made the answer settle deeper than the words themselves. "Because you still think you have something to lose," he said, and I felt that in a way I could not explain, because he was not just talking about me. He was revealing something about himself too, something unspoken but present in the way he held that distance, in the way he chose not to take what he easily could. And I realized then that this rule, this space he maintained, it was not just about control, it was about restraint born from something else, something I had not uncovered yet. And as that thought settled into place, quiet but undeniable, I understood one thing with a clarity that had been missing until now. Staying here was not just about surviving this situation anymore. It was about understanding it, understanding him, and maybe, eventually, understanding why a man who could have everything chose to leave one thing untouched. The words stayed with me longer than they should have, echoing in the quiet spaces of the house even after he walked away, because they did not feel like a statement about me alone. They felt like something deeper, something rooted in a truth he had learned long before I ever stepped into his world, and I found myself replaying them as I moved through the rest of the day, through rooms that no longer felt entirely foreign but still did not feel like mine, noticing small details I had ignored before, the way everything was arranged with intention, the way nothing was left to chance, the way even the silence felt controlled. And for the first time, I began to understand that this place was not just about power. It was about discipline, about holding everything together with a kind of restraint that most people never needed to learn. And that realization shifted something in me. Not enough to change how I felt, not yet, but enough to make me look at him differently, not just as the man who had forced me into this life, but as someone who had chosen parts of it carefully, deliberately, including the one rule that now defined everything between us. And that thought followed me into the evening, when the house grew even quieter, when the outside world faded into distant lights and muted sounds, leaving only the steady rhythm of this controlled environment. And I found myself standing in the hallway again, not lost this time, not uncertain, just aware of where I was, and why I had not left, aware of the choice I had made and the questions that still lingered without answers. And I turned without thinking, walking toward the part of the house I had not explored yet, guided by something I could not quite name, until I found him again, exactly where I should have expected, in a space that matched him perfectly, a study lined with dark wood and clean lines, quiet and deliberate, like everything else about him. And he did not look surprised to see me, not even slightly, as if he had known I would come here eventually, as if this moment had been just another part of something already set in motion. "You should rest," he said, not looking up immediately, his attention still on whatever was in front of him. And for a second I almost turned away, almost let the moment pass without saying anything. But I did not, because something about the way he moved through this world, the way he held that distance without breaking it, made silence feel like the wrong choice now. "You do not sleep much, do you?" I said instead, and his gaze lifted then, meeting mine with that same steady focus. And for a moment neither of us spoke, because the question was not really about sleep. It was about everything else, about the control, the restraint, the choices he made that did not fit into anything I understood, and he seemed to recognize that, because when he answered, his voice was quieter than before, but more direct. "Sleep is a luxury," he said, and I frowned slightly. The words simple, but carrying something heavier underneath, something that suggested a life where rest was not always possible, where control came at a cost I had not considered. And I took a small step further into the room, not closing the distance completely, but enough to feel the shift, enough to acknowledge that I was no longer standing at the edge of his world. "And what about choices?" I asked, the question forming before I could stop it. "Are those a luxury too?" And this time, he did not answer right away, his gaze holding mine in a way that felt different, more focused, more real, like I had stepped into something he did not usually share. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried that same quiet certainty. But now there was something else there, something I could not ignore. "Only when they matter," he said, and the meaning settled between us with a weight that felt undeniable, because I understood it now, not completely, not fully, but enough to recognize the truth behind it, that this was not about control in the way I had first believed. It was about choosing when to use it and when to step back, when to take and when to leave something untouched. And as that realization settled into place, I felt something shift again, something small but irreversible, because for the first time since this began, I was not just reacting to him. I was seeing him, not as a force I had to resist, but as a man shaped by choices I did not yet understand. And that made everything more complicated, more uncertain, but also more real. And as I stood there in the quiet of that room, meeting his gaze without looking away, I realized something that I had not been ready to admit until now. He may have controlled the world outside these walls, but inside this space, inside this rule he had set between us, the one thing he refused to take, the balance had already begun to shift, and neither of us was pretending not to notice.